February 1945, northeast Germany, temperature -18 Celsius. British forces advanced through collapsing Reich territory when reconnaissance discovered abandoned labor camp housing 200 German women auxiliaries, communications operators, logistics clerks, nurses, left behind by retreating Wehrmacht. No food, no heat, no transport. Command faced impossible choice: leave enemy civilians to freeze or divert critical resources during active combat operations. What followed challenged every assumption about duty, humanity, and the true meaning of victory. The blizzard arrived without warning on February 14, 1945, transforming the Pomeranian landscape into a white hell. Major Thomas Hartley of the 7th Armored Division stood outside the requisitioned farmhouse that served as temporary headquarters, watching snowflakes the size of shillings obscure visibility to less than 20 meters. The temperature had plummeted to -18 Celsius overnight, and meteorological reports warned of worse conditions incoming. His breath formed frozen clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating. Behind him, the sounds of war continued unabated. Artillery rumbled in the distance like approaching thunder. Radio operators transmitted coordinates in clipped voices. Lorries struggled through accumulating snow, their engines protesting the brutal cold. The British advance through northeastern Germany had accelerated dramatically since January. Pushing through territory the Wehrmacht could no longer defend with diminishing resources and exhausted troops. Every kilometer gained brought Allied forces closer to Berlin, closer to ending this interminable conflict that had consumed Europe for nearly 6 years. Lieutenant James Whitmore entered the farmhouse, stamping snow from his boots, his face reddened from exposure despite the woolen scarf wrapped around his neck. "Sir, reconnaissance patrol has returned. Captain Morrison requests your immediate presence." The lieutenant's Manchester accent carried unusual urgency. Hartley had commanded men long enough to recognize when routine reports contained something unexpected. The reconnaissance patrol consisted of 8 soldiers who had spent the previous 36 hours probing German defensive positions 15 kilometers northeast. They stood in the farmhouse's main room, shoulders hunched against residual cold, hands wrapped around tin mugs of steaming tea. Captain Richard Morrison, a veterinarian from Devon in civilian life, looked profoundly disturbed. His normally steady hands trembled slightly as he set down his mug. "We found something, sir. 5 kilometers north. Thought it was another Wehrmacht staging area initially." Morrison paused, choosing words carefully. "It's a labor camp. Small facility. Maybe 200 women. German auxiliaries, communications operators, logistics personnel, medical staff. The Wehrmacht abandoned them 3 days ago when they pulled back." Hartley absorbed this information with growing unease. "Abandoned them entirely?" "Yes, sir. Left them locked in barracks with no transport, no supplies, no means of evacuation. The guards departed without warning when they received retreat orders. Took all vehicles, food stores, fuel. The women are trapped in unheated wooden structures with temperatures dropping hourly. They're burning furniture to stay warm, but there's precious little left. Many are already showing signs of severe hypothermia. Without intervention, most won't survive another 48 hours in these conditions." The room fell silent, except for the wind howling outside. Hartley understood immediately the complexity of what Morrison had discovered. These women were technically enemy combatants, auxiliary personnel who had supported Wehrmacht operations. Under normal circumstances, they would be processed as prisoners of war according to established protocols: documentation, interrogation, transport to holding facilities for eventual repatriation. But circumstances were anything but normal. "How many require immediate medical attention?" Hartley asked. "At least 40, possibly more. Frostbite cases, malnutrition, several pregnant women in advanced stages. One appeared to have pneumonia." Morrison's medical training made his assessment authoritative. "Sir, the ethical position is clear. We cannot leave civilians to freeze regardless of nationality. But the operational reality is complicated. Complicated was an understatement. The division was engaged in active combat operations with stretched supply lines and limited transport capacity. Every vehicle was allocated to moving ammunition, fuel, food for fighting troops. Medical resources were prioritized for treating British casualties and liberated Allied prisoners. Diverting resources to evacuate enemy auxiliaries would require command authorization that might not be forthcoming. Hartley walked to the window, staring out at the intensifying blizzard. Behind him, junior officers waited for direction. The British Army had trained him for tactical decisions, not moral philosophy. Yet war repeatedly presented situations where the two became inseparable. He thought of his wife Margaret back in Sussex, her last letter mentioning their daughter's 10th birthday. He thought of universal human vulnerability to cold and hunger. He thought of what sort of peace would emerge if victory was achieved through abandoning basic humanity. "Prepare a dispatch to brigade headquarters," he said finally. "Inform them of the situation and request permission to evacuate the women to the rear. Emphasize humanitarian necessity and potential intelligence value. Lieutenant Whitmore, inventory our transport capacity. Captain Morrison, organize medical assessment protocols for mass casualties. We move within 2 hours regardless of response from brigade." The officers dispersed to their tasks, energized by clear direction. Hartley knew he was exceeding his authority. Brigade might court-martial him for prioritizing enemy civilians over operational efficiency. But he also knew that certain decisions transcended military regulations. If the British Army stood for anything beyond battlefield victories, it was the principle that civilization endured even amid barbarism. Leaving 200 women to freeze would represent a different kind of defeat, one that corroded the soul of victory itself. Outside, the blizzard strengthened. Visibility dropped to 10 meters. Temperature continued falling. The wireless operator received brigade's response 90 minutes later. Negative on transport allocation, focus on primary objectives, local commanders' discretion on minimal humanitarian aid. The message was clear. Headquarters would not officially sanction a large-scale evacuation, but neither would they explicitly forbid it if Hartley chose to act independently. He gathered his officers one final time. "We proceed. Commandeer every available vehicle. The women are our responsibility now, regardless of what regulations might say. If we're court-martialed after the war ends, at least we'll know we behave like human beings." The men nodded, understanding they were about to undertake an operation that would never appear in official histories, but might define what kind of soldiers, what kind of men they truly were. The journey to retrieve 200 freezing German women had begun. The convoy assembled in the farmyard at 1400 hours on February 14, 1945, Valentine's Day, though no one mentioned the irony. 12 lorries, 8 jeeps, 3 ambulances liberated from a captured German medical depot, and 2 fuel trucks formed an improvised rescue column that violated every principle of efficient military logistics. Hartley stood beside the lead vehicle, watching soldiers load blankets, rations, medical supplies, and portable heaters scavenged from various sources. The blizzard had intensified, transforming the landscape into an undifferentiated white void where sky and ground merged into single hostile entity. Sergeant William Fletcher from Birmingham, a lorry driver in civilian life, approached with characteristic directness. "Sir, with respect, this is madness. Visibility is near zero. Roads are impassable. We'll be lucky if half these vehicles reach the camp, luckier still if any return. We're risking trained soldiers for enemy auxiliaries who were complicit in everything the Reich has done." Hartley had expected resistance. Fletcher wasn't wrong about the tactical absurdity. "Sergeant, I'm not ordering anyone to accompany this mission. Those who wish to remain behind may do so without consequence. But I'm going, and I suspect others will follow. The women didn't choose this war any more than your sisters or mine did. They followed orders, same as us. Now they're abandoned and dying. We're in a position to help. That's sufficient reason." Fletcher's expression softened. "Understood, sir." Just needed to know you recognized the risks. My lorry's loaded and ready." He saluted and walked away, breath forming frozen clouds. Within minutes, the entire convoy reported prepared for departure. Hartley felt something approaching pride despite the circumstances. These men understood that military duty sometimes transcended killing enemies and seizing objectives. The journey north began at 1430. Almost immediately, conditions proved worse than anticipated. Wind speeds exceeded 70 kilometers per hour, driving snow horizontally with force that reduced visibility to less than 5 meters. Roads disappeared beneath accumulating drifts. Vehicles slipped on ice, requiring constant course corrections. The temperature, already brutal, dropped further as afternoon progressed toward early winter darkness. Hartley rode in the lead jeep, Navigator Lieutenant Whitmore beside him, consulting maps that had become nearly useless in conditions where landmarks vanished. The convoy moved at walking pace, vehicles maintaining close formation to avoid losing sight of each other. Several times drifts forced detours through fields where vehicles became mired in snow, requiring crews to dig them free with entrenching tools while exposed to wind that cut through layers of wool and leather like razors. Radio communication became intermittent as atmospheric conditions interfered with signals. Hartley relied on motorcycle dispatch riders to maintain contact between vehicles. Young soldiers who volunteered to ride through blinding snow, carrying messages that kept the column cohesive. One rider, Private Colin Hughes from Wales, returned from the rear with frostbitten fingers, but refused medical attention until the mission concluded. 2 hours into the journey, the third lorry developed mechanical failure, frozen fuel lines that stopped the engine completely. The crew worked frantically to restart it, breath freezing into beards of ice, hands losing sensation despite gloves. After 30 minutes, they abandoned the vehicle, redistributing its supplies among remaining lorries and continuing forward. The disabled lorry was marked for later recovery, though everyone understood it might remain buried until spring thaw. At 1600 hours, with darkness approaching and temperature now -23°C, the convoy reached the camp. The facility appeared like a ghost settlement emerging from white void. 12 wooden barracks arranged around a central square, surrounded by wire fencing already half buried in snow. No lights, no movement, no signs of life except thin smoke rising from one structure where occupants had managed to maintain a fire. Captain Morrison led the medical team into the first barracks. What they discovered exceeded worst projections. Women huddled together in masses of 30 or 40, sharing body heat, wrapped in every available piece of fabric. Many were unconscious from hypothermia. Others stared with empty eyes that reflected resignation to death. The air inside was barely warmer than outside, breath visible, condensation frozen on walls in thick frost layers. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Major, medical situation is critical. Immediate evacuation is not medically advisable. Moving them in this condition could cause cardiac arrest, but leaving them is death sentence. We need to stabilize as many as possible before transport." Hartley made the hardest decision of his military career. Begin triage, prioritize those who can survive transport, deploy portable heaters in all barracks, distribute hot tea and rations. We'll move them in waves, most critical first. Work through the night if necessary. No one gets left behind. British soldiers fanned out across the camp, kicking in locked doors, carrying heaters and supplies, speaking words of reassurance in broken German or simple gestures. The women responded with disbelief, then gratitude, then tears. Many had resigned themselves to freezing quietly, convinced British forces would ignore their plight or worse. The reality of rescue broke through emotional numbness that had allowed them to endure. Private James Cooper from London, 19 years old, carried an unconscious woman to an ambulance, her body so light from malnutrition he could barely feel her weight. "She's breathing, barely," he told medics. "Please save her." The medics worked with efficiency born from treating countless casualties, wrapping her in heated blankets, administering glucose solutions, monitoring vital signs. Throughout the night, the evacuation continued. Soldiers carried women through blizzard conditions to waiting vehicles. Some women could walk with assistance, others required being carried bodily, British soldiers lifting them with care that contradicted years of propaganda depicting enemies as subhuman. The wind screamed, snow fell without cessation, temperature dropped to -26°C, yet the work continued without complaint. By midnight, 140 women had been loaded into vehicles. 60 remained, the most critical cases requiring continued stabilization. Partly coordinated operations from the central barracks, functioning on tea and determination. His uniform was soaked through with melted snow, body shaking from cold, but stopping was unthinkable. Around him, exhausted soldiers maintained their efforts with characteristic British stoicism, making dark jokes about the absurdity while never slowing pace. At 0300 hours, the final woman was loaded. The convoy began its return journey through conditions that had somehow worsened. Vehicles crawled through white darkness, drivers navigating by instinct more than sight. Inside lorries, British soldiers sat beside German women, sharing body heat, offering what comfort exhausted men could provide to exhausted women who had expected death and found instead improbable humanity. The journey back took 5 hours. Not a single life was lost during transport. Dawn on February 15, 1945, revealed the impossible scene that military protocol had no category to classify. In the farmhouse compound that served as British divisional headquarters, 200 German women auxiliary prisoners occupied every available space. Barracks, storage sheds, the farmhouse itself, even the garage where vehicles normally sheltered. British medics moved between makeshift hospital beds, administering treatment with supplies stretched beyond intended capacity. Soldiers shared rations with former enemies, conversing in fragmentary German or gestures that transcended language barriers. The immediate medical crisis stabilized by mid-morning. Captain Morrison compiled his report with clinical precision. 47 cases of severe frostbite requiring ongoing treatment, 12 cases of pneumonia or respiratory infection, 8 pregnant women receiving prenatal care, 3 emergency childbirths anticipated within weeks. Malnutrition was universal but manageable with proper feeding protocols. Mortality rate 0. Against all reasonable expectation, every woman had survived evacuation and initial treatment. Brigade headquarters responded to Hartley's report with stunned silence followed by terse communication. Explain operational rationale for resource diversion during active combat operations. Full written justification required. The bureaucratic language barely concealed command's discomfort with situation that complicated clean narratives of war and peace. But the complication extended beyond British command structure. German military intelligence, monitoring British radio traffic, detected references to large-scale movement of auxiliary personnel from abandoned camp. Wehrmacht command initially dismissed reports as disinformation or exaggeration. No army would divert resources to rescue enemy civilians during combat operations. The tactical inefficiency was incomprehensible. Oberst Heinrich Kramer, Wehrmacht intelligence officer stationed 20 kilometers east, reviewed intercepted communications with growing confusion. The British deployed 12 lorries, multiple medical vehicles, fuel trucks. They risked vehicles and personnel in blizzard conditions. For what purpose? To capture auxiliaries who pose no military threat? The intelligence value is minimal. These women have no knowledge of strategic operations. His adjutant, Lieutenant Wilhelm Strauss, offered conventional interpretation. Perhaps it's propaganda, Herr Oberst. The British will photograph the rescue, publicize it to demonstrate superiority and demoralize our forces. They're playing the humanitarian angle for political benefit. Kramer wasn't convinced. Wehrmacht doctrine, shaped by years of total war ideology, presumed enemies operated with same ruthless efficiency that characterized German operations. Resources were allocated based on strategic value. Compassion was weakness that undermined military effectiveness. The British action violated these fundamental principles so thoroughly that it suggested either incompetence or something Wehrmacht thinking couldn't adequately explain. "Monitor the situation," Kramer ordered. "If this is propaganda operation, we'll detect preparation for publicity. If it's genuine humanitarian rescue, we need to understand what that means for our assumptions about British operational doctrine." The women themselves struggled to process their salvation. Margaret Schultz, 32, former communications operator from Hamburg, sat in the farmhouse kitchen drinking tea that British soldiers kept replenishing. She had spent 3 days convinced she would freeze to death, had written farewell letters to family she expected would never be found. Now she was warm, fed, receiving medical attention from soldiers who spoke kindly despite language barriers. "Why?" she asked Lieutenant Whitmore in halting English learned from school years before the war. "Why risk your men for us? We are enemy. We would be left to die if positions were reversed." The question wasn't accusatory, but genuinely bewildered. Whitmore, whose brother had died at Dunkirk, whose Manchester neighborhood had been devastated by Luftwaffe bombing, considered his response carefully. "Because leaving people to freeze is wrong regardless of what uniform they wore. Because we're trying to end this war, not become like those who started it. Because when it's over, we want to remember we behaved like human beings." He spoke the words believing them, surprising himself with conviction that transcended years of accumulated hatred. News of the rescue spread through British forces with remarkable speed. Soldiers stationed at other positions heard about the operation through informal networks that existed beneath official channels. Reactions varied. Some approved enthusiastically, proud that British Army maintained humanitarian standards even amid brutality of warfare. Others questioned the wisdom of diverting resources from defeating Germany to aiding Germans. Most responded with characteristic ambivalence, accepting the complexity without requiring simple judgment. What no one anticipated was the effect on German forces when knowledge of the rescue filtered through Wehrmacht ranks via escaped prisoners and civilian channels. German soldiers, indoctrinated to believe British were decadent and weak, discovered enemy troops had risked lives to save German women who contributed nothing to British military objectives. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some dismissed it as Allied propaganda, others recognized authenticity and felt something approaching shame that their own command had abandoned those women without hesitation. A few began questioning the propaganda they'd consumed for years about British barbarity and German cultural superiority. The rescue accomplished something no military operation could achieve. It introduced doubt into absolute certainties that sustained Wehrmacht morale. Kramer received confirmation 3 days later from multiple sources that the rescue was genuine, unaccompanied by publicity operations or propaganda exploitation. The British had simply rescued dying women because it was the right thing to do, then continued with military operations as though such actions were routine. He filed his report with notation that would haunt him for remainder of war. British operational doctrine incorporates humanitarian considerations that Wehrmacht planning does not account for. This represents philosophical divergence we may not have capacity to understand or counter. The perplexity was mutual. British command struggled to classify the women. They were technically prisoners of war, but had committed no combat actions. They were German nationals, but victims of Wehrmacht abandonment. Bureaucracy designed for clean categories of friend and enemy found no adequate box for people who were simultaneously both and neither. Eventually, pragmatic British improvisation prevailed. The women would be treated as refugees, requiring humanitarian assistance, processed through civilian channels rather than POW protocols, cared for until war's end when repatriation could be arranged under safe conditions. In barracks and farmhouse rooms across the compound, German women and British soldiers coexisted in strange peace that existed nowhere else in February 1945. They shared meals, exchanged stories through broken language, discovered common humanity that propaganda had worked desperately to obscure. When the blizzard finally broke on February 18th, revealing landscape of pristine white, both groups looked out at the same world transformed, wondering what kind of peace would emerge from war that could produce such unexpected moments of grace amid overwhelming brutality. The war ended 93 days after the rescue. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, British forces were 30 kilometers from Berlin, having advanced through territory where similar acts of improvised humanity had occurred repeatedly. Liberated concentration camps, protected civilians, maintained discipline when vengeance would have been understandable. The 200 women from the forgotten labor camp were processed through refugee centers, provided medical care until recovered, then repatriated to shattered Germany, where they dispersed into the chaos of post-war reconstruction. Major Thomas Hartley returned to Sussex in August 1945, expecting court-martial for operational irregularities. Instead, he received quiet commendation from brigade commander, who noted in confidential file, "demonstrated initiative and humanitarian judgment consistent with highest traditions of British military service." The commendation was never publicized, never added to official record, filed away in archives where it would remain unexamined for decades. The army, uncomfortable with actions that complicated clean narratives of military efficiency, chose to acknowledge the rescue privately while avoiding public celebration. The rescue operation cost the British military 12 lorries damaged beyond immediate repair, 3,000 litres of petrol, medical supplies equivalent to treating 200 combat casualties, and 400 man-hours diverted from combat operations. By strict accounting, the operation represented catastrophic waste of resources during critical offensive. By any other measurement, it represented something precious preserved amid war's calculated destruction. Captain Richard Morrison returned to Devon, resuming veterinary practice that seemed absurdly peaceful after years of treating battlefield trauma. He never spoke publicly about the rescue, mentioning it only once to his wife Eleanor when she asked why he sometimes woke at night, checking that house was warm enough. "We saved 200 people who would have frozen," he said simply. "It seemed important then. Still does." Eleanor never pressed for details, understanding some memories carried weight that explanation couldn't convey. The women themselves returned to Germany fractured beyond recognition. Margareta Schultz settled in Hamburg's ruins, working as translator for British occupation forces, using English skills that had once seemed useless. She married in 1947, raised 3 children, never forgot the British soldiers who carried her through blizzard when Wehrmacht had left her to die. She told her children the story, emphasizing the lesson that nationality meant less than shared humanity when conditions became extreme. In 1963, 18 years after war's end, historian James Wellington researched British military operations in northeastern Germany for comprehensive war history project. He discovered reference to Pomeranian rescue operation in archived logistics reports. 12 lorries deployed, 200 German auxiliaries evacuated, resources expended without corresponding military objective achieved. The brief notation included no context, no explanation for why experienced commander had violated protocol so dramatically. Wellington pursued investigation, tracking down surviving participants through regimental associations. He interviewed Hartley, now retired civil engineer in Brighton, who spoke reluctantly about decisions made during blizzard conditions. He found Morrison, contacted several soldiers who had participated, and through patient research, located 7 of the rescued women still living in Germany. From fragmentary testimonies, he reconstructed operation that official histories had ignored. His article, published in obscure military history journal in 1964, attracted little attention initially, but it resonated with emerging scholarship questioning simplistic narratives of war as purely strategic exercise devoid of moral complexity. The rescue represented something academics struggled to categorize, a moment where individual ethics superseded military efficiency, where soldiers recognized obligations that transcended defeating enemies. In 1978, survivors organized reunion in Hamburg. 12 British veterans traveled to Germany, meeting women they had carried through snow 33 years earlier. The gathering received modest local press coverage, photographs showing elderly British men embracing elderly German women, caption noting, "Former enemies remember shared humanity." Hartley, 71 years old, spoke briefly, "We did what seemed right. The rules said leave them. Conscience said otherwise. We followed conscience. I'd make same decision today." The reunion prompted discussion about war's moral dimension that extended beyond battlefield victories. Younger generations, removed from conflict's immediacy, recognized the rescue as exemplar of principle they valued, that civilization's measure wasn't determined by who won battles, but by how winners conducted themselves. The operation had saved 200 lives that contributed nothing to military victory. That apparent uselessness was precisely what made it significant. Wilhelm Strauss, Wehrmacht adjutant, who had monitored British operations, emigrated to Canada after war, working as accountant in Toronto. He read Wellington's article with profound emotion, remembering his own bewilderment when intelligence confirmed the rescue's authenticity. In letter to journal editor, he wrote, "We were taught British were decadent, weak, incapable of decisive action. Then they proved strong enough to show mercy when we had abandoned ours. That strength we never understood. Perhaps that's why we lost, not just militarily but morally." By the operation's 50th anniversary in 1995, most participants had died. Hartley passed away in 1989, Morrison in 1992, Fletcher in 1994. Of the 200 rescued women, fewer than 30 survived. But the story persisted, documented in archives, preserved in family histories, examined by scholars exploring war's human dimension. The rescue proved something fundamental about capacity to maintain humanity when circumstances conspired to justify its abandonment. The soldiers who carried freezing women through blizzards gained no tactical advantage. They received no medals, no public recognition, no career advancement. They simply did what conscience demanded when regulations suggested otherwise. In doing so, they demonstrated that British values, fair play, decency, reluctance to inflict unnecessary suffering, weren't mere propaganda, but principles worth upholding, even at cost to military efficiency. The legacy endures in military ethics courses that use the operation as case study in moral leadership. It persists in families descended from rescued women who remember that enemies once chose humanity over hatred. It survives in understanding that war's purpose is ultimately to restore peace, and peace requires remembering we're human before we're soldiers, that compassion isn't weakness, but strength that distinguishes civilization from barbarism. When the last survivor died in 2003, she left diary begun in 1945. First entry, dated February 15th. "British soldiers carried me through blizzard. I thought they would leave us to freeze. They proved me wrong about many things. Perhaps that's what victory should mean, proving better versions of ourselves exist even in worst moments." Her words, preserved in German war memorial archives, stand as testament to operation that received no official recognition, but achieved something military victories alone could never accomplish. Proof that humanity could survive war's attempt to extinguish it. The untold stories of the Second World War reveal humanity's capacity for compassion even amid unimaginable conflict. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more forgotten narratives that shaped history. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did Major Hartley make the right decision? What would you have done? Join our community exploring the moral complexities that define who we become when tested by circumstances beyond imagining. History isn't just battles won and lost, it's choices made when no one was watching.